Picture this: a Tuesday morning in 2024, somewhere in the South Midlands. A family sits down to breakfast as the news reports economic stability, markets up, inflation cooling. Yet somehow this family is poorer than in 2008. Not from accident, from design. Not absence of effort, from absence of choice. Britain has achieved something remarkable in 16 years. It kept its banks upright, pound sterling credible, institutions intact, and still lost its living standards. This paradox explains what follows. A country can preserve its balance sheet while hollowing out its households, which means understanding requires tracing a specific mechanism across 16 years. What happened here echoes beyond these shores, because other nations face the same pressures and the same temptation to choose short-term stability over long-term prosperity. Real wages matter most when understanding how people actually live, not GDP growth abstractions or stock indices that reward the wealthy. Real wages tell you what workers earn adjusted for inflation, which is the only figure that matters when the bill arrives. In 2008, the average British worker earned just under £29,000 annually in today's money. In 2025, that figure reached £29,500. 17 years of work produced £500 of forward movement. But examine the composition more carefully, and the picture darkens significantly. For workers aged 22 to 39, the years when you should build savings and plan futures, real pay remains stubbornly below 2008 levels. Young people have effectively lost a decade and a half of wage progression. Meanwhile, housing costs have more than doubled since 2008, heating bills have tripled, and childcare expenses have become a second mortgage payment that arrives every month. The mathematics demands you perform the calculation yourself. Wages up £500 annually, while rents rise hundreds every single month. This is not recovery or improvement. It is managed decline disguised as stability and technical competence. The squeeze had a specific beginning, September 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed and the financial system froze. Britain, more exposed to banking catastrophe than almost any comparable economy, faced a choice between letting the payment system die or writing a cheque to save it. Governments chose rescue. The cost reached £137 billion in direct bailouts. Someone had to foot this enormous bill eventually. That someone became you, because in 2010, a new government decided deficits were the fundamental enemy and austerity was the cure. Over the following decade, state spending was cut in real terms almost every single year without exception. Hospital budgets froze, teacher numbers fell, public libraries shut. Critically, wages in the public sector, where 5.5 million Britons work, were either frozen completely or capped at 1% annually, while inflation ran between 3 and 4%. You calculate the gap yourself. The real value of every public sector paycheck deteriorated steadily. The mechanism was straightforward: preserve institutional stability while shifting costs to workers. Which is why understanding this period explains everything that follows. Let me be direct about what austerity accomplished. The NHS received ring-fence protection, which sounds like security. It was mathematics. Population rising, health needs escalating, inflation at 3 to 4% annually. Standing still while inflation runs forward is cutting by inflation. Hospital budgets declined 4% annually in real terms. This sounds administrative. It was not. Staff fell. Maintenance backlogs reached £6 billion nobody could fix. By 2018, France spent 22% more per capita on healthcare. Germany spent 47% more. Not a first world system. A first world system running on third world budgets. The same logic applied everywhere. Local government grants cut by 40% in real terms. Social care hollowed. Youth services contracted. Public health shrank. The state did not disappear during austerity. It became incompetent. Service degradation became permanent. This eventually reshaped who trusted government and why they did not. But the real mechanism of the squeeze came from housing, where households faced an expanding gap between wages that remained stuck since 2008 and asset prices that soared relentlessly upward. In 1995, the average English home cost 3.5 times a worker's annual salary. By 2024, it costs 7.7 times. and in London reached 12 times annual earnings, which means your salary never tripled, but the houses did. The mechanism is straightforward and mathematical. Demand outpaced supply because population rose while construction did not keep pace. Every new regulation made building slower and more expensive. Planning permission became a multi-year bureaucratic process. Result: permanent scarcity. Scarcity meant prices could only move upward, and rents followed prices upward. The average private rent in England now reaches £1,362 monthly, consuming 35% of income for low-wage workers. Housing benefit officially covers 80% of rents, but the benefit itself is frozen. The gap between what benefit pays, what rent costs now reaches £337 monthly for a one-bedroom flat. Only 2.5% of private rentals remain affordable to those claiming housing benefit, which transforms renting from shelter into extraction. Your income is insufficient by design. Rents are unaffordable by mathematics, and this relationship will pull from your future for decades. We now arrive at something structural and fundamental that explains why living standards fell and why they cannot easily recover. Investment. Not stock investment or financial trading, but capital investment in machinery, factories, infrastructure, research, the tools that multiply productivity and wages. Productive workers command higher wages because they produce more per hour. Britain invests less in capital than almost any comparable economy. In 2024, whole economy investment reached only 17.9% of GDP. France achieved 25%, Germany 24%, and only Italy among G7 peers performed worse. Why so little? Start with austerity, which created a double effect. When the state cuts spending, private investment does not rise automatically to fill the gap, but instead shrinks in tandem. Then add uncertainty. In 2016, Britain voted for Brexit, and for a decade afterward, investment became toxic to plan because every long-term bet depended on unknowable political outcomes. Why build a factory for EU markets if tariffs make them economically inaccessible? Why hire skilled workers if free movement of labour ends? Why invest in expansion if everything is contingent on political decisions that remain unresolved? One careful estimate suggests Brexit itself suppressed investment by 12%, below what otherwise would have occurred, which sounds abstract until you recognise what low investment means for the future. Productivity growth is the engine that generates prosperity, and Britain's engine has progressively seized. In the 1990s, productivity grew at 2.3% annually. In the 2000s, it slowed to 1.6%. In the 2000s, it collapsed to 0.6% per year. In the 2000s, it declined further to just 0.4% annually, which means a British worker today produces only marginally more output per hour than a worker in 2008 produced 16 years ago. You are not imagining the slowdown because the engine genuinely has seized. Meanwhile, American productivity accelerated since 2019 to 1.9% annually, which widened the gap between countries significantly. If Britain had matched America's productivity growth since 2010, total output would be 23% higher today, which means your wages would be 23% higher. That is not marginal. That is the difference between modest comfort and chronic squeeze lasting decades. Why is Britain so slow? The obvious answer lies in low investment, because British firms invest in fewer robots, less research and development, less worker training than German or American competitors invest. The deeper answer emerges from the composition of British business. Finance is huge, manufacturing shrank to almost nothing, and finance productivity is difficult to grow because managing money does not compound into real wage gains, whereas manufacturing is where machines multiply your productive hours. Now add a secondary layer that compounds household pressure. Fiscal drag, which is a mechanism where taxes rise without legislation because allowances are frozen while inflation runs forward. Tax allowances were frozen in 2017. The personal allowance, the amount you earn before paying income tax, stopped rising, remaining at £12,570, while inflation consumed purchasing power relentlessly. Inflation ran at 8% some years. Your real tax-free income fell silently. By 2025, more than 2 million people were pulled into income tax, who would not have been if allowances had tracked inflation, which is a stealth tax rise that requires no parliamentary vote. Not explicit tax increases, it is fiscal drag, a passive mechanism that achieves the same result. National insurance thresholds were frozen, capital gains thresholds were frozen, inheritance tax thresholds were frozen. Frozen means slowly swallowed by inflation. The Institute for Fiscal Studies calculated that in 2025, average working household paid an additional £500 annually in taxes compared to 2010, even though real income had barely moved upward. You earn more pounds but keep less because taxation has silently risen. That is the mechanism. Taxes rise while wages stagnate, meaning your claim on your own income fell systematically. While austerity, housing, investment and taxes worked together to squeeze households, something else was dissolving: political capacity to implement change. In the 8 years from 2016 to 2024, Britain had 5 different prime ministers, each arriving with promises of reform but departing faced with structural problems no one could solve through political will alone. David Cameron called the Brexit referendum and lost the referendum. Theresa May spent 3 exhausting years negotiating a deal almost nobody wanted. Boris Johnson won an election with a large majority and then self-destructed in real time. Liz Truss lasted 49 days. Rishi Sunak inherited a party that had already lost the nation's confidence. In 2024, Labour won with a large majority on a smaller vote share than Cameron had achieved 12 years earlier, which reveals how voter attachment had eroded. Every election since 2017 was framed as choosing between catastrophes, not visions. None of them could tackle the structural problems. Investment remained too low, productivity remained flat, housing remained unaffordable, wages remained stagnant. You cannot campaign on that truth. You campaign instead on, these other people are worse. The political system became a mirror of the economic one. It preserves stability by managing decline rather than addressing fundamentals, which means reform becomes impossible, regardless of which party governs. And then 2021 arrived, with a cascade of shocks. Energy prices tripled globally. Supply chains fractured from port closures. Inflation rose from 2% to 11.1% by late 2022. Everything happened simultaneously. The inflation was not primarily British, it was global, driven by Russian oil disruptions and Chinese supply chain collapses and container shipping prices that jumped from $30 to $3,000 on key routes. But Britain was especially exposed and vulnerable to this shock because real incomes were already so thin that no household had reserves. The state had been cut to the bone. Housing costs were already at breaking point before inflation accelerated. When global inflation hit, British households had no financial cushion. An estimated 7 million low-income households went without heating, food, or showers in 2024. That is 1 household in every 5 across a G7 economy. Those conditions have not improved since. They have become embedded as normal. Bottom 40% incomes are projected to be £440 worse off per year by 2029 than they were in 2024, which means the squeeze is not temporary or cyclical, but structural and permanent given current policy paths. This is not volatility, it is depression styled as inflation, which explains why nominal wage growth feels meaningless when your actual purchasing power contracts. Here is what puzzles observers. Why did British institutions not respond forcefully to crisis? The Bank of England raised interest rates repeatedly, which was correct policy for fighting inflation, but devastated households carrying mortgages because rates jumped from near zero to 5.5% almost overnight. Higher rates also dampened investment further, because why would you fund a factory if your cost of capital just doubled in months? The Treasury tightened fiscal policy, also correct in principle. Governments should save during booms, but precisely wrong in timing, because households were already squeezed, and further state cuts to services meant private pain was mirrored by public degradation. You get a sense of institutions choosing between bad and worse, selecting whichever preserved their own stability. The NHS did not collapse during this period, but waiting lists hit 9 million appointments. Schools did not close, but teacher shortages meant classes grew larger. Police did not vanish, but response times to crime lengthened. Everything still functions technically. Nothing worked well or effectively. This is the institutional mirage. A country can keep its institutions upright while their actual services corrode systematically, which means the average person sees only corrosion while leaders point to technical stability. They call it decline. They are entirely right in their assessment. One statistic deserves extended examination. In April 2025, workers aged 16 and 17 earned 27% more in real terms than their counterparts in 2008, which seems to contradict the overall story, until you understand what produced this anomaly. They faced a different labour market entirely, one that was tight and competitive. Employers had to pay more to recruit entry-level workers because competition was fierce. But that same 16-year-old, if they remained in the same job trajectory, would find wage growth stopping entirely once they reached their 20s, which is when workers used to see acceleration. Older workers, who entered the labour market in the 2000s or earlier, have never recovered from the financial crisis. They took the full brunt of the squeeze. Their median real wage in 2025 was at or below 2008 levels. They had mortgages. They had dependent children. They believed their salary would compound over decades. It did not. Britain has created a permanent two-tier system. Young, entry workers with reasonable wages because of labour scarcity, and everyone else watching time steal their value year after year. This fractured the labour market fundamentally. It did not happen by accident. It reflects that wage setting shifted from collective bargaining to individual negotiation, which meant workers lost the structural power to demand wage growth, and employers could post rates workers either accepted or rejected without negotiation. The cruelest mechanism created by housing policy is that it divided the nation into two irreconcilable groups: those who owned property before 2008 and those who did not. If you bought property before the crash, you became substantially wealthier without effort. A home that cost £150,000 in 2008 is worth £290,000 today. The owner earned stagnant wages, but their wealth exploded. A person born in 1990 cannot replicate that path anymore. They cannot save for a deposit because rents consume their income faster than they can accumulate savings. Their strategy was rent first, buy later, which is mathematically impossible when rents rise 9% annually and wage growth is 1%. The gap between rental growth and wage growth is permanent, which means they are not building toward ownership, but paying someone else's mortgage forever. This is not merely unfair distribution or generational bad luck. It is systematic extraction, where landlords pull value from tenants faster than wages can replenish it. The rent-to-wage ratio has shifted from sustainable to predatory. This is legal and even celebrated as investment returns. What it actually is, wealth transfer from working people to asset owners, which is structural. Only supply-side reform, building millions of homes fast, could break the cycle. Every government declares they will build, but none actually do, because home-owning voters are numerous and vote reliably, while renters are numerous but vote less consistently. Housing remains profitable for owners. And then there is Brexit, which inflicted a specific wound on capital formation that has not healed. From 2016 onward, uncertainty about Britain's trading relationship with the EU suppressed investment systematically because every capital plan had to be recalculated and every supply chain reconsidered under unknowable political futures. For a country already struggling with investment levels, that uncertainty was the precisely wrong additional pressure at the wrong moment. The estimates vary depending on methodology, but most serious analyses suggest Brexit reduced business investment by 10 to 12%, below what would have occurred under continued EU membership. It also reduced long-term productivity growth by roughly 4%, which sounds abstract until you recognise that this represents 7 to 8% of national income foregone permanently. That is the difference between modest recovery and stagnation that extends across decades. What did Britain get in return for this cost? Market access that was objectively worse than before. Trade with the EU became frictionful. Exports and imports both fell 27 to 32% in the immediate aftermath of trade arrangement changes. Some rebounded over time, not all. Firms became smaller, more inward-focused, less ambitious internationally. A country that had seen modest productivity improvements in the 1990s suddenly was competing with a ball and chain. The political system could not acknowledge this cost because half the country had voted to accept it, which meant the squeeze continued, but now, with deliberate self-constraint baked in. So why has nothing fundamental changed in 16 years of stagnation? Surely any competent government could have tackled this. Increased investment in productivity-enhancing capital, deregulated housing to enable massive construction, reformed education to boost productivity and wages, rebuilt public services after austerity. The answer reveals something about how democracies function under pressure. Each solution has a cost that no government wants to pay in their electoral term. Increase public investment? That requires cutting current services or raising taxes visibly. Both destroy electoral prospects. Deregulate housing? That means building in green belts, offending millions of voters. Reform education? That means questioning whether traditional universities are still the right model. Maybe shorter, cheaper, more vocational paths are wiser. But that conversation offends institutional interests. Reform pensions? That means acknowledging that elderly workers' benefits rose while younger workers' wages fell, which is politically impossible. Leaders choose instead to manage decline, presenting tiny improvements as victories. They announce NHS in special measures while still underfunding it. They praise housing starts while knowing they are far below replacement rates. They declare strategies that sound transformative while implementing policies that preserve the status quo. Governments preserve facades of normality over bases of stagnation, which is rational under political constraint, but catastrophic for long-term prosperity. Here is the question no one in power asks publicly, because the answer is uncomfortable. What happens when decline becomes too visible to ignore, when people cannot maintain the fiction of stability? When waiting lists become years instead of months? When home prices require 3 generations of savings simultaneously? When young people stop voting because they believe the system is rigged against them? When private school enrollment expands while state school enrollment shrinks to skeleton levels? When every conversation is about crisis management instead of future building? Britain is not at rupture point yet, but the velocity toward it is accelerating. Polling shows declining faith in institutions, declining satisfaction with the direction of the country, declining belief that your children will be better off than you are now. These are the leading indicators of either reform or rupture. A government could still choose the reform path, invest heavily in infrastructure, manufacturing, research, remove planning constraints and build housing at unprecedented scale, raise public servant pay to retain talent, fund education and innovation, create a high-skill, high-wage economy instead of a low-skill holding pattern. It would require visible tax rises or spending reallocation. It would require disappointing some voters. It would require 5 to 10 years of sacrifice before improvement arrived. No government has chosen this because electoral cycles are 4 years, which means the system optimizes for the next election, not the next decade. And the squeeze continues while the political system waits. Let me trace the mechanism one final time. Investment collapsed after 2008 due to austerity destroying demand and Brexit destroying confidence. Low investment meant low productivity growth. Workers had fewer tools to work with. Low productivity meant wages could not rise faster than inflation. Wages stagnated, costs rose everywhere. Rents rose faster than wages, extracting household wealth. The state was cut dramatically. Public services corroded systematically. Private spending had to fill the gaps. Fiscal drag silently raised taxes on stagnant wages. Disposable income for saving fell. The labour market shifted from collective bargaining to individual negotiation. Workers lost wage-setting power. Housing policy locked scarcity into place, enriching the old while imprisoning the young. Brexit added another 4% productivity reduction and uncertainty. The political system, fractured by all these pressures, could not make the structural changes to reverse the squeeze. Instead, it managed decline and called it stability. The result is a country that is stable in the way a coma patient is stable. Not thriving, functionally surviving. You can measure this clearly. Not GDP per capita, The median. Not billionaires, the people whose children you need. The median income stagnated. That is what matters to you. In 2008, the world economy nearly died. Britain kept the hospitals open, the banks functioning, the currency credible. But it chose austerity when investment should have expanded. It chose to protect the wealthy while wages froze for everyone else. It chose Brexit when it should have stabilised expectations. It chose not to see the cost. A country does not need a crash to decline. It just needs 1,000 small decisions, each seeming rational in isolation. Do not raise wages because you cannot afford to. Do not invest because the future is uncertain. Do not build homes because it upsets voters. Do not reform because change is risky. Do not tax the rich because they leave. Do not educate the poor beyond what you think they deserve. And then, 16 years later, the average worker earned less than a day's extra wages. 30-year-olds will never afford homes. Nurses and teachers speak with desperation because their salaries never matched inflation. The squeeze was not inevitable, accidental. It was chosen. Not from incompetence, from rational fear. And it was if your goal was preserving institutions and protecting asset owners. If your goal was broadly shared prosperity, it was catastrophic. Britain kept its institutions and lost its living standards. That was the choice. It did not have to be.